I need some traction. You need some traction.
Hey everyone, Lloyd Lobo here, co-founder at Boast AI and TractionConf. This webinar is brought to you by Boast AI Launch Academy in partnership with Founder Institute, Lazarides Institute, and BCF Ventures. I am super stoked today because the person I respect the most in marketing, I would call her like the godmother of B2B marketing, right?
Oh God,
I think
that is quite the title to live up to.
Yeah, she's the godmother of B2B marketing. So Hana heads up marketing for Shopify Plus. They're an e-commerce platform that powers some of the biggest brands. So a departure from the regular Shopify, Hana has helped scale them, sell to the largest brands like New York Times and Rebecca Minkoff and whatnot. And prior to joining Shopify, she led marketing and growth in a variety of industries. You may have heard of Uberflip being a very popular company that she helped scale to tens of millions in revenue. And then when she's not running marketing or being a total marketing genius, she also speaks and contributes to podcasts and publications like entrepreneur.com, CMO, Fast Company, and whatnot. And you're also a martial artist. Like you taught martial arts professionally for a very long time, right? How long was
Yeah, that was past life. That was my job. I taught martial arts professionally. I also ran marketing and was the GM for a couple of locations of a franchise. So I think there were about 6 or 7 locations. So this was back when marketing was like very, very different. We used a lot of traditional channels, a lot of like local stuff and newspapers, and we were just getting to that point where you could like kind of game local search on Google because it was starting to become a thing, and like Twitter was becoming a thing. So it was a cool like inflection point and like my first like attempt at like taking a company and actually doing growth online because it was barely a thing then. It was super fun.
So you can literally kick ass, not just like.
I mean, I gotta say I'm a little rusty these days. I used to be able to kick ass. I'm not sure how much I can kick ass now.
Awesome. There's also an interesting story. Hannah grew up in Kuwait, much like me. And were you also a refugee during the Gulf War?
No, so I was born in Kuwait. We immigrated here, but my family's Jordanian, so it's a little bit muddled.
Awesome. Yeah. So I grew up in Kuwait, and then during the Gulf War, I traveled as a refugee and then ended up in Jordan and no man's land. So that's that also personal connection. Awesome. So let's kick things off. Give us your backstory. How did you end up going from martial arts into tech and specifically startup marketing?
Past life, I spent about a decade in the martial arts industry. It was, kind of random. I sort of fell into it by accident, which I think has been a bit of a theme for me. And for a period of time, like I mentioned, I was general manager for a couple locations. There's a franchise of several studios. And then I also sort of ran the collective marketing initiatives. And it was at a really interesting time where online was like I said, just starting to become a thing. And I started to realize in, talking with, friends and friends from school and connections within the startup community and the tech community, which was sort of everywhere at Shopify, that, hey, I can actually kind of transform marketing strategy and actually start to leverage online for a lot of it in a local business that was used to very traditional channels, and it would be more effective and it would be less expensive. So that was my first dabble into like online marketing and digital. And then I just got sort of sucked into the tech and startup community. I think that happens to a lot of people, is you just kind of get the bug, and started meeting people, making connections, going to all of the community startup things. Interestingly, this was in Ottawa at the time, and I actually remember going to meetups at Shopify's old office when it only had like 30 employees. So this was a very, very long time ago. And I think since then, my focus has really been on sort of the startup space. Worked on a few startups, but also worked with a few startups, mostly around growth and marketing. I got sort of more the B2B SaaS world probably a little over a decade ago. And that was fun because B2B and SaaS is like a totally different challenge, right? And ended up in Toronto. As you mentioned, Lloyd, worked with a few startups, worked at Uberflip for a number of years, was ready for sort of the next thing, and Shopify was it. And was really excited because Shopify was just on the brink of blowing up Shopify Plus, which is sort of the upmarket offer for Shopify.
Before we go into what should startups do from B2B marketing standpoint, tell us what's wrong with startup marketing.
I think that there's a couple things that are really challenging with quote startup marketing. I think the biggest problem is that there is no shared understanding or language on what we actually mean by marketing, and that is the foundational problem that I think sends startups and individuals and founders and marketers in the wrong direction. I think in many cases, what I see is a founder saying, "Hey, I need marketing," and a marketer being like, "Hey, I want to do startup marketing," but they both think marketing is a very different thing. All the way from marketing meaning lead gen and growth and pipeline and all of these things, to marketing being communications and PR and social and all of these other things and everything in between. So I think the fundamental issue with startup marketing is that right off the bat, most conversations don't have a shared understanding of what we even mean by marketing. I think the other piece is many startups and founders are almost always looking for this unicorn marketer when they're first starting up. And that's not generally possible or even useful. I think without understanding and identifying what you actually need, I think trying to understand who you should hire or find this sort of unicorn marketer is not productive or a good use of time. And it goes back to understanding, like, what do we mean by marketing here, folks? And what is it that the business actually needs?
So this is a good segue into the first segment here. You were early at Uberflip, and effectively, you were also early at Shopify Plus, right? Because they were formulating this product. Yeah. So really a startup within a large company, and then Uberflip and doing your own startups. Say you were a new startup founder. Where do you start with marketing?
Maybe nowhere. To be totally honest, maybe nowhere. I think a lot of startups don't even need to think about marketing initially, right? They need to think about growth, but marketing is not necessarily the only or the best lever, depending on your business, your model, your customer, and what it is that's going to be most impactful in a short period of time. And it also depends on the stage that you're at. So what I would be thinking about if I were a founder is, number one, I would be thinking about things like positioning. I mean, I'm not even going to sort of get into product market fit. Let's assume that that's a thing that potentially you have. I think before you even think about marketing, understanding your positioning, I think is critical. And I think it is the foundation for everything you do, because if you try and do marketing things with poor positioning, it's like rolling a boulder uphill. Nothing will work, or it'll sort of work, or it won't work that well. So nailing down your positioning is super, super, super critical. And I would not spend $1 on marketing without putting some really critical thinking on that. I may experiment to see if I'm right, if I'm not sure, or if I don't have product market fit. But that's the first step. I think part of positioning it's the 101 stuff. It's really understanding your customer and your audience, understanding the context around your product. And this is not what most people want to hear, because most people are like, yeah, of course, that's obvious. The problem is everybody glosses over it. They don't actually go as deep as they should when it comes to that stuff.
There's a cool quote you said, I think at a previous Traction, or maybe you referenced April Dunford. You said, marketing is polishing turd and and positioning is turning turd into fertilizer.
Yes, yes, that is the quote, and that is me quoting April Dunford. And I can see in the chat here some questions around positioning. So let me touch on this a little bit before I talk through it though. I think for those of you who have not read or connected with April Dunford, she is by far the startup positioning pro. Look her up online, April Dunford. Tweet her right now if you want. Tell her I am talking about her. She has a great book called Obviously Awesome that literally takes you step by step on how to figure this out. And it gives you a framework and questions that you need to answer in order to nail down your positioning. And those questions are things like, who is your audience? What actual value are you providing? And what is the differentiation, right? And I think we lie to ourselves around like how we think our product is different from everyone else. So I would say that is your go-to expert on that.
Before we go into like acquisition and going up market and whatnot, I think because you hit the nail on the head here, it's a very, very important part. What are some key ingredients of good positioning? Like if you came into a startup today, how would you help them frame their positioning?
Well, the first thing I would do is I would tell them to read April's book. That would absolutely be it. So I think some of the questions that you need to answer beyond like who is your audience, and I do really mean going deep on that. And your audience is not everybody. It's really rare that it's actually everybody. But I think you need to really understand things like what are the competitive alternatives. And I don't mean competitors, I mean competitive alternatives. And for some of you, the competitive alternative might be a spreadsheet or a fax machine, or something that actually fills that need in a way that is sort of satisfactory for now. I think some of the other areas to understand from a positioning perspective is really the unique value that you're providing and like leaning into that. And really understanding how to actually talk to your customers about that. Because if you don't understand what the unique value that you provide is and how to talk to them about it, at the end of the day, like they're not going to understand why they should choose you versus somebody else. So understanding the competitive alternatives, what else solves the problem, understanding your audience, and then building the context around your product. Every decision you make sends a signal to the market around how you want to position yourself in the market. So for example, if I take my product and I price it super, super high, that's a signal that you're not for small businesses, right? So pricing is a consideration when you're thinking about your positioning. I would say the other key thing to really understand too is like, not just at the customer level, but in terms of like your actual market that you're going after. Are you creating a new category that doesn't exist, right? Or are you disrupting an existing category? Those are two very different things. And how you position based on those things is going to be different. What the competitive landscape looks like is going to be different in terms of how you position yourself. So those are the questions that I would ask. The reality is it's super different depending on the company, and the approach might be similar, and the frameworks and the questions might be similar, but like where you end up is going to really depend on the market, the company, and what it is that you're actually doing. Is this a new category? Is it disrupting? Is it something else entirely? As a market gets more mature, you see this right now, like let's take an industry like, I don't know, marketing automation or even sales automation, or like any of those sort of SaaS-based businesses that you're starting to see. As a market gets more mature, what you start to see is more sameness, right? Because people start to talk the same, companies start to talk the same, they start to build very similar features, and differentiation starts to actually decrease because everybody's playing catch up with everybody else and they're building out all the features. Trying to differentiate purely based on technology is incredibly difficult to do. So the end result is like you go to the website of, let's say, any of the biggest SaaS vendors like a Salesforce or an Oracle or an Adobe or like any of those, you're going to see basically the same messaging. They're probably going to tell you something about how they help you make great customer experiences. Literally, that's what they'll say. And like, you'll see everybody saying this in a market, and that creates a lot of buyer confusion. And that sameness is actually really interesting place to disrupt. And I think you can differentiate on more than just technology or just product. Actually, I think you have to differentiate on a lot more than that. Otherwise, you're all just peddling the same shit to everybody's point.
What is the positioning for Shopify Plus?
That's actually a really great question. So as we look at Shopify Plus, fundamentally, what we have leaned into is really building the future of commerce in hand in hand with our merchants. We are anti legacy enterprise. We are anti-software, legacy software. We are not Oracle. We are not Salesforce. And sometimes the most powerful way to position yourself is to actually declare what you're not. And we have fundamentally come out with the message that enterprise software and legacy software is broken. And it has now sort of tricked everybody into believing that you have to pay insane amounts of dollars for software that gets progressively worse the more you pay for it. I can't remember if this was Lauren, who's my boss, who's GM of Shopify Plus, or even Toby that said this, but software is one of the only places where as the price increases, the quality gets worse, right? And any of you who have used really enterprisey clunky software, you see that. And that's why it's so ripe for disruption. So we position ourselves against that old mentality of legacy enterprise software. Thing to understand is positioning is not messaging necessarily. Those are two different things. I think once you nail down your positioning, then you need to translate it into a message that's going to resonate with your audience, that's right for the channels you're leveraging, et cetera.
You took on the Shopify Plus in the early days, I would say that. What and just general recommendations from running now 3 early products companies.
Yeah.
What marketing tactics, channels, strategies did you focus on during the first few months, maybe the first 180 days?
It was very different in all of those scenarios. I can walk you through a little bit of our focus at Shopify Plus initially, but I would also say that it was a little bit of a unique scenario. So when I first started at Shopify Plus, there was no marketing. It was basically a sales team. And what I'll say is, I think that is actually a really viable and great approach from a startup perspective, is prove it out with sales, talk to customers, get on the front line, get on the phones. And then marketing can start to actually pull some growth levers to start to build out and scale and build out sort of that repeatable revenue engine. So when I came in, it was sort of an interesting scenario because like lead gen was not the problem, where for a lot of startups, that's actually the initial thing that you want to solve is the lead gen piece. And I think, the challenge we had was actually filtering through all the noise and filtering through the huge amount of volume that was coming through. So, I mean, for those of you in B2B, there's typically at a high level, if you're really generating like inbound for a sales team, leads are going to come in. We're going to have some way to qualify them to say, hey, they're good. And then, sales is going to pick them up or they're going to get nurtured or whatever that might be. There was no filter there at Plus. And we didn't have the infrastructure to build it. We had a bunch of data silos we needed to figure out because Plus was really a pirate ship. It was like a startup within Shopify. It was like off and running on its own. So big part of what I focused on initially was actually systems and how do we actually get visibility into like quality. It wasn't about more, it wasn't about volume, it was about better, it was about quality. So that was our initial focus. But I think for a lot of startups, that's actually not often the starting point because the starting point is really around building momentum around that lead gen and inbound piece. And I mean, listen, there's a ton of channels you can activate around that. I think part of, your decisions there are going to depend on the industries that you're in and where your customers live. Ultimately, you just need to find out where they hang out, and that's what you need to go after.
That's a great way to put it. Find out where your customers live and
Yeah.
go after them. There's this marketing giant list of things you can do, right? There was this book that came out called Traction, and there's like 21, 22 channels, everything from email to outbound to community to ads. How do you prioritize? Because focus is a key thing.
Prioritizing channels is like secondary to defining objectives, right? And what you want to do. I think once you have a sense of, hey, what is it we're trying to do, and the answer to that might be revenue growth. The answer to that might not be revenue growth. You might not care about revenue growth, and maybe what you care about is actually just pure play customer acquisition. And I think understanding that and understanding what your North Star is then needs to actually fuel the decisions around which tactics and channels may be more effective. At the end of the day, though, it's kind of a judgment call, right? So, I mean, if you understand what your North Star is, again, maybe that's just like customer ads and you don't really care about revenue. Maybe it is revenue. That needs to, again, fuel which channels and tactics you actually choose. But once you have clarity on your North Star and you really understand where it is that your customers live, understanding those two things will help you eliminate probably a bunch of those channels, right? It'll become clear what you shouldn't do. And then there will be a huge list of things you could do, right? And then at that point, again, it's a judgment call. You need to actually start to think about, okay, where do we start? One word of caution is most marketing teams make the mistake of going too broad too soon. So watch that, because I think it's not productive for the company. You don't actually learn a ton because you're not actually going deeper on a couple of the tactics or channels that you've chosen.
What were some big failures and mistakes you made along the way as in your early days doing B2B marketing at Uberflip, at your previous company, or Shopify Plus?
Now, I think mistakes, I guess, fall into a few different categories. I think some mistakes or fails around tactics that we chose and things we tried to sort of experiment with. Those are many, right? I mean, we at one point spent a whole bunch of money on a certain ad channel that we were convinced would work. Turns out it was a dismal failure and we wasted a bunch of money on it. That's definitely happened. I think the biggest mistake, though, that I would say that I've made in the past that I'm really cognizant of here is making sure you're bringing everyone along for the ride. And what I mean by that is, whether you're working with a sales team or a customer success team, or whether there's others around, I think it's incredibly important to make sure that there's really fast feedback loops. And it's really easy to underestimate how communicative you need to be around all of the things that are happening, especially when things are moving super quick at a startup. So that's something that I've always been tried to be more cognizant of as we are moving quickly to execute.
So going into Upmarket then, what made, because Shopify was doing phenomenal, already multi-billion-dollar company. What made Shopify go Upmarket, and how should companies think about the timing to move Upmarket?
Yeah, so I think this is a great question, and I think it is a nuanced answer. When we look at Shopify and what we did, we didn't move upmarket, we stretched upmarket. And that's a really subtle, but I think important distinction. We were not sort of shifting our focus away from small businesses and entrepreneurs to now focus on this bigger market opportunity because, there's more money or there's more revenue or et cetera. We really wanted to stay laser focused on the entrepreneurs and the small businesses, but we were also starting to get pulled up market by our own customers. here's really what happened, right? I mean, I think many folks are familiar with Shopify's story. Shopify grew really big, really fast, primarily focused on those small businesses and entrepreneurs initially. That was what Shopify started off as, with frankly no plans to expand beyond that. But as Shopify was growing really big, really fast, a really interesting thing happened. Some of those small businesses that started on Shopify also grew really big, really fast. And they became big businesses. They started doing tens of millions of dollars in revenue, hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue. They were no longer small businesses. They were no longer small entrepreneurs. And one of two things would happen when they got to that level. So number one, they would churn onto sort of an enterprise e-commerce platform. Or number two, they would just figure out a way to kind of make it work on Shopify. And the question at that time was really, okay, cool. We have these merchants now that have gotten really big. How do we help them stay on Shopify longer so they don't churn into these like legacy enterprise software platforms? What is the product, the service, the offer that we need to pull together for these merchants? So that was the first iteration of Plus, and it was very much an experiment. I'm pretty sure the first thing that happened was we threw up like enterprise on the Shopify pricing page to just see if anyone clicked on it. And it was initially really supposed to only be an upgrade mechanism, right? So merchants were growing, they were ready to quote graduate from the core Shopify platform, and we wanted to build something for them to go so they could stay on Shopify longer. Here's what was interesting with that model. We started to see, once we had this Shopify Plus sort of like offer there for them, we started to see people upgrade. It was working really, really well. And we built out a small sales team, and they had started upgrading people. But we also started to see people migrating back to Shopify Plus now that it existed, now that Shopify had an enterprise platform, from those big enterprisey competitors. And that kind of made us be like, oh, white space in the market there. And we took a look at that market, and it was obvious that there were not good solutions. That entire mid-market, which was really the focus, I would say mid-market to enterprise, had maybe one solid solution in the mid-market, and then a bunch of very, very enterprisey solutions. And frankly, they were basically all on premise at the time. SaaS was not a thing, which blew my mind coming into Shopify. I was like, oh, we need to explain to people why SaaS is good. I was like, literally, my mind was blown. And that's really sort of what prompted Shopify Plus to start to build out more than just a sales team. It built out a full stack product line within Shopify that was fully focused on that audience, with marketing, with product, with sort of all the teams that we needed to really go after that mid-market to enterprise audience.
A good way to think about it is like, you didn't expect people coming back to Shopify.
No.
So
Yeah, and I think that says two things. I think that says that like legacy enterprise is like so ripe for disruption. It's so broken. And I think that also is related to just what's happening in commerce, right? I mean, part of this is we work really hard to build great product. Part of this is like retail and commerce is fundamentally changing, and the internet is expediting everything. So like, it's not lost on us that there's like other factors at play here as well.
Then what were some of the considerations that went into pricing, and how should companies think about pricing when they go up market?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think the challenge with pricing at the enterprise level, and the stance or the philosophy that we're taking is sort of counter to that and in line with our positioning of like almost anti-enterprise, right? Let's be real. Most big enterprise software companies, they charge based on what they think you're willing to pay, right? They charge a big company big dollars because a big company can afford to pay big dollars. has nothing to do with the actual value or a fair exchange of value. The way we think about it is that it needs to be a fair exchange of value. And software doesn't necessarily have an infinite dollar amount to it. And I think the most important thing to consider with pricing is not just how much do you charge. I mean, that's a factor of your unit economics, and you need to go through sort of figuring that out and the value that you provide. It's a little bit like, what is the value that the customer perceives as well. But at the end of the day, it's a matter of, hey, how do you actually price this in a way that is clear to the customer, that is not overly complex, that helps them walk away feeling as though they are truly getting value out of this. And if we're honest, and if any of us have used a lot of legacy enterprise software, most of the time, what you have is what I think is like the trifecta of an industry that's ready to be disrupted, where you have an industry where the software is super clunky and everybody hates it. It's super duper expensive, but they buy it anyway. That's the magical intersection of like an area that needs to be disrupted. And I think that's something that we realized pretty quickly.
Fantastic. I'm going to ask the question that everyone is here for in a way. What are some tips and tricks to generate warm enterprise leads? How do you guys do it at Shopify Plus, or how have you done it previously? And then tying into that, we'll dive into the processes and tools and metrics you need to have in place.
The tactics are the tactics, right? The right thing for you, maybe through content, maybe through SEO, maybe through straight up like paid acquisition, although you need to be careful with that. I think partnerships is an interesting way to do that. I think Shopify has played with all of those things and continues to double down on the ones that really work. I would say also don't underestimate a hyper local approach, particularly these days, where you're connecting sort of in market with folks that you need to be connecting with, particularly on enterprise, particularly if they want like a human being. I think what's more important than the specific tactics and the channels is like, what value are you providing to them within those channels, right? And again, whether that's like driven by content, whether that's driven by product messaging or product-led type of campaigns, really depends. But like, there's no one size fits all. Use these 3 channels, and that'll drive inbound marketing leads and warm leads for sales. I think the magic comes in how you activate those channels. Again, the channels are the channels. Y'all know what they are. And there's interesting ways to activate them. There's interesting interactions you can create on sites. For example, we use Drift on the Shopify Plus page. That's one point of connection that we really like. There's a million of those tools. Intercom is another one. There are a ton of ways to connect with customers. I think, like, again, it's not so much the channels themselves, although you need to choose ones, again, that are where your customers live. It's how you actually activate them, how you approach them. The biggest factor, I think, in like actually getting people to pay attention to you is you have to have a point of view, and you actually have to like say it and be a little bit like gutsy about it, because at the end of the day, it's all the same shit. They're seeing that sameness that we talked about before.
What is the best way to approach a company for a partnership?
You have to be really clear on what the value to both parties is. And what I would say is, like, what I see a lot in startups is like 2 startups decide to like partner together, and they're really excited, and maybe there's some cool like partner fit and whatever it might be, except neither of them have any audience and not a lot of customers. So like, who cares, right? If they're partnering together. I think you have to really clearly understand the value that you will provide to the partner, but also that the partner will provide to you. So who's providing value from like a reach and distribution perspective, who can provide value from like a product perspective. Maybe there's like a feature or a function. This is why a lot of like sort of the bigger app stores and ecosystems are really, really valuable. I mean, Shopify has a huge app store and ecosystem. And I think like when we think about partnerships, it's, hey, who are the developers and partners that are actually creating things that are valuable for our customers? That's valuable for us. When somebody actually comes in and provides something that's really valuable for a merchant, that we're not really building or haven't built within Shopify. At the same time, we are providing value to our ecosystem, and sometimes that's through rev share and even through sort of events or marketing in some cases, et cetera. So at the end of the day, it all comes down to value. Most companies have a partnerships org. Figure out who that is, figure out who to reach out to and who the right people to reach out to. But if you don't have a good answer for what value you're going to provide, whether it's to the company directly or to their customers, no one's going to listen to you. I can say that because we have people reaching out to us constantly around partnering with Shopify.
Definitely. Awareness versus acquisition. So most B2B startups need customers now and pay little to no attention to awareness.
Yep.
But it's critical for top of the funnel, right? So what is your advice for balancing investment in awareness versus acquisition? Like kind of sign up now.
There's an inflection point where awareness starts to become more important. And I think that inflection point is usually once you've started to build sort of some critical mass of customers that you can also leverage to create awareness, right? Is like, how do you actually make your customer the hero and start to use them to start to create some of that buzz in the market? I think, some of the best marketers that I know are really great at making startups look really, really big, but not actually be really, really big and like have a good footprint in the market without spending a ton of money or even like doing a lot of things, right? But they've got great positioning and they actually start to provide air cover for sales and for the acquisition tactics with some really choice activations, whether that's like showing up really strategically at like an event in person with the right people. And listen, 10 years ago, I would have been like, event marketing, no way. But like, it can be super effective. Or whether that's through like, content or something along those lines. But you'll hit an inflection point. And I think it'll start to become clear when you need to provide that air cover. One of the best ways to do that though is like really leverage your customers and let them tell your story.
Definitely. Now, how has your marketing strategy changed during COVID at Shopify?
So what we did at Shopify when the pandemic hit was we actually, first sort of made sure our people and our employees were situated and everyone was like set up at home and doing as well as they could post-COVID. Obviously, that was a very difficult time for a lot of people. And then, forgetting just marketing for a second, but like stepping back across the company, we did a very fast, very rigorous start, stop, continue across all of Shopify. Our CEO Toby Luque basically said delete all plans that you had previously and let's take a look at what it is that we need to do now, because we were in a really unique position to actually help merchants and get people online so that they can actually keep their businesses going. So everything across Shopify was reevaluated around what we needed to start, what we needed to stop, what we needed to continue. So the first step was really pivoting and orienting the company on the most important things that merchants needed immediately. And that made marketing easy, because at that point it was all about, all right, how do we actually message this? How do we make sure merchants know where to go for support? What else can we do to support them, right? Which levers can we pull? Which content do they need to be able to get their store online as fast as possible? How do we accelerate onboarding and launch for the bigger customers? It's bananas, but like, there are so many large retailers, massive retailers, that literally don't sell online. And guess what happened post-COVID? They had zero cash flow. They had zero money. And they were knocking on our door being like, how fast could you get us online? That was what we spent the majority of our time. And that was how our strategy had to change at Shopify. I think, the other pieces that we looked at as well is like reevaluating a lot of the stuff that we just had in market, to make sure that, we were not being tone deaf to the world and what was happening. And frankly, that's an ongoing thing given the world and what's happening in it. So that's something that we've got a really close eye on. And really leaning in on the areas of like, where can we add value and where is Shopify uniquely positioned to help. A really great example of that, we recently launched Operation Hope, and really looking at, hey, how do we partner with different organizations and work with different sort of key players to, help promote more Black businesses? How do we get 1 million of them online? So those are the types of things that came out of these conversations, but ultimately it was just around what's the best for the customer.
What does your marketing stack look like as you recommend to different startups you advise or you talk to?
Yeah, so I think the marketing stack you're going to build as a startup, it's obviously going to look really different from what we build, what we have at Shopify. But I think like the thing that people often underestimate is like getting your data in order and the piping and the plumbing to actually connect into these tools. I think like if you have that figured out initially so that you don't end up in a scenario where you have a whole bunch of data silos, you're going to actually be in a really good spot. You'll have to evolve it over time, obviously, because the companies get bigger and more complex. But I would say like the biggest piece is like try and avoid building out these like siloed tech stacks across the company. At the same time, you don't want to slow anybody down, right? Like you want people to be able to just like plug and play and use the tools that you need. So I'm a big fan of like, don't build it in-house if you don't need to. Leverage the third-party tools that are out there. Listen, for B2B, it's going to be something around CRM, something around marketing automation, probably some plug-and-play stuff if you want to do chat, if you want to do things like webinars, if you want to do like live workshops, events, etc. But I think like foundationally, make sure the plumbing is super, super solid. And I would also say go the extra effort to also get some like unique product insights piping into those tools, right? Because I think there's a lot of interesting sales and marketing tactics that can hinge off understanding product usage. So that's sort of what I would say there. But I would keep it simple initially if you can, because very quickly people end up with these massive stacks and just like don't even understand why, right?
Is there like I guess one or two tools that you recommend, sort of like early companies, right? Like maybe Series A or post seed going into B. Like I see a lot of Marketo Salesforce combos now. HubSpot's making a big push.
Yeah.
What have you used and what do you like?
Yeah, I've used all of those things. I would actually say, like, even at Plus, we initially used HubSpot because it was very, very much a startup within Shopify. And HubSpot was sort of combined marketing automation and CRM, as I think most of you know. It integrates with a lot of the adjacent tools for like things like webinars and chat and stuff like that. I can tell you my team really liked it from a usability standpoint. I would say like, again, keep it as simple as possible. Now here's the reality. We got to a point very quickly where we just needed feature functions that weren't available in HubSpot that were just like at the scale that we needed to. And there's also a lot of complexity in sort of how we needed to integrate from a data perspective. So we are now on like a Marketo Salesforce build. But like, I think there's a ton of ways to skin that cat, to be totally honest. And I think every org is going to need something a little bit different. What
were like those key realization points that, hey, we need to move off HubSpot? Like, were there one or two that would just made it?
Oh, man. Everything was breaking. Yeah, so I think like when we got to a point, so what HubSpot was great for initially was like the teams could do the things, right? So like sales could use it to like look at a customer's profile, make calls, blah blah blah. Marketing could use it to like send emails and kind of do what they needed to do. When we started to actually get to a point where at scale we needed more insights and data, we needed to better control the sales piece of it. So one thing that we ran into was like there was no real great way to do like accounts in HubSpot because of the way it was built. Now, this was a few years ago. I don't know if that's changed. It may have. I would say do your due diligence. That was a big blocker for us, is like not really being able to structure accounts in the way that we wanted to. We also, in certain areas, couldn't put mandatory fields in for sales reps to fill out, which basically meant we were running blind when we were trying to do any kind of win-loss or understand like close won reasons, close lost reasons, because frankly, sales reps weren't filling them out. Right. So that was a bit of a challenge. And there were also a lot of challenges too that were like really unique to Shopify around, how we needed to like integrate sort of on our end with the tooling.
Question here around balancing brand and performance investments when brand is really hard to measure with no immediate ROI.
It partly depends on what we mean by brand and what we mean by brand marketing. I think there's a couple ways to look at this. Are we talking about marketing and campaigns with like a brand-led message, but there are still like performance KPIs attached to it? Or are we really talking about like very, very top of funnel awareness, brand familiarity, for example, is a metric that gets thrown around a lot. And doing things like out of home campaigns and billboards and that type of stuff. I think like first I would make that distinction. I would also say it's very industry specific on how much you should spend and where the sliding scale is on that. Generally speaking, in B2B, I would focus less on brand and less on things like PR until you start to get more mature. But what I'll also say is like in some industries, it's totally different. We see D2Cs on Shopify that are like consumer focused that go heavy on brand, and it works really, really, really well for them. So, I don't know if anyone is like not B2B. I feel like this is probably a B2B heavy audience, but it can work in some scenarios. I would say though, like I've always been a fan of like bottom of the funnel up, like get really solid, from the bottom of the funnel and start to like layer on the next levels of growth. And eventually brand does make sense for some companies earlier than others. And in some ways you can also do like smart creative things that are like not measurable, but also don't have to be a massive investment, but are like smart and connect with your audience. So I would think of some of those things as well.
Awesome. I want to take this question from me over here. We're at the company where I work at, value perception problem with clients we service greenhouse growers who have been using the same archaic technology for years and it works. They're not internet savvy, hands-on people, and it's really hard to explain the advantages. Maybe we take this now, or you can take it later. But how do I?
I mean, that's like a straight up positioning problem, literally. And what I would actually say is like, if you have customers, I mean, I'm sure it sounds like you have some customers, let them explain it, right? Ask them what the value is from their perspective, because they will be in a better position to figure out how you should explain it to other people. So I would find the people that like love your product and would be super bummed if like it didn't exist, and have them tell you why. Use their words, and that should actually feed into your positioning.
Any parting advice? We have a few minutes here. I got it. Positioning before everything. You need to have product market fit. Talk to customers. And get to a point where they would be really, really unhappy if your product doesn't exist. Get them to explain the product to you, but like really product market fit, positioning. Top 3 other marketing takeaways for the audience.
I think you open this with like what's wrong with marketing. So I'm going to give you a little like here are the things that are wrong with the problems with marketing. And I think hopefully there's some tips that we can extract from there. So I think, thing number one, as marketing scales, it becomes really complex, and it becomes necessary to be really explicit about defining what marketing means in your organization, because marketing is unlike any other org, except maybe like a product org. But like, if you look at sales, if you look at customer success, if you look at customer service, those are people that are all, for the most part, doing a similar job, right? Their roles are very much the same. They can focus on their own thing. But if you look at a marketing team, it is a team of people where there's a hugely broad range of skill sets and domain expertise. And they don't just do their own thing. They all have to work together to do most of the things, which makes it inherently challenging and complicated when you get to a point where you have to actually scale marketing. This is why I would say do not go too broad too soon, because you're going to add unnecessary complexity that's probably not going to give you the impact that you need. So that would be sort of number one. Number two, I would say avoid puking rainbows. A lot of times what happens is, marketing's not super plugged in to the customer, to the positioning, to really understanding the growth levers. What you'll often see, and it's usually triggered by like this one thing, and usually it's a calendar invite that pops up in your email that says brainstorm session. In my opinion, those are the two most dangerous words. And that's not to say that brainstorming is bad, but usually what ends up happening is a bunch of marketers walk into a room and they start brainstorming about positioning or content or campaigns or whatever the thing may be. And they start talking about, in all of these flowery terms and glowing adjectives. And they start talking about like ice cream and rainbows. And pretty soon that's infectious. And it becomes like the entire company talking about like these really flowery marketing-y terms. And I think that's like, sets the foundation for really poor marketing. I think before you get into any kind of brainstorming, you have to go back to the foundation and you have to nail down your positioning and look at all of the inputs that need to feed into marketing, like your customers, like feedback from the front line, sales, customer success, like looking at the data, looking at product usage, really understanding the positioning before you get into a room and start puking rainbows.
As you look back over the years from going from martial artist to godmother of B2B marketing, what do you wish you did less of and what do you wish you did more of?
I wish I did more listening, particularly in the early days, particularly to like those, adjacent teams. I think when it really clicked, like how much insight you could really pull from them, it was like a game changer for me. And I wish I had that sort of clicked for me earlier. What do I wish I do more of? So I wish I had made faster decisions, more faster decisions, if that makes sense. And here's why. I think in a lot of cases, we ruminate on a good decision. We actually waste a lot of time deciding or thinking about it. If you've done a good job and have a good framework for actually articulating like the pros and cons and like understanding what needs to go into the decision, waiting longer doesn't actually help you make a better decision. What actually is the right thing is to just make the decision faster and get to like pass or fail as fast as possible to understand. So I think like that is what I wish I also would do more of. I don't know if I answered that question right, but I'm gonna leave it there.
Thank you so much, Hana. It was great, fantastic. Wishing you great success. Thanks everyone for joining us.
I need some traction.